I'm going to begin by actually introducing everyone here today. So let's start with David Unger. David Unger was born in Guatemala in 1950. In 2014, he was bestowed Guatemala's Miguel Angel Asturias National Prize in Literature for Lifetime Achievement, the first author writing exclusively in English to win a major Latin American literature award. He is the author of Sleeping with the Light On, The Mastermind, and his novel has also been published in Spanish, Italian, Arabic, Armenian, and Polish. He has translated 16 books in English. Paro Anand. Paro Anand is a Sahitya Academy Bal Sahitya Award winner for her book Wild Child, now published as Like Smoke. She has written books for children, young adults, and adults. She also works with children, especially with those in difficult circumstances, through her program Literature in Action. She has been awarded for her contribution to children's literature by the Russian Center of Science and Culture. In 2019, she was awarded the Kalinga Karubuki Literary Award for Fearless Women Writers. Nupur Dhingra Paiva is a chartered clinical psychologist, associate fellow with the British Psychological Society, child therapist, and mother of two. She started Family Tree, a child and adolescent mental health team, in 2018. She teaches infant observation on the psychotherapy training course at Ambedkar University in Delhi. She is also the author of Love and Rage, The Inner Worlds of Children. With her husband, Richard Paiva, she is a co-founder of The Art of Sport, a development program for girls that uses sport and group therapy. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so excited to get started. So today we're actually discussing something which is very close to even my heart. Of course, all of you have done a lot of work in it, but it's such a relevant conversation. I'm so excited to begin. So we're talking about the complex worlds of children. We're talking about the turmoils that children go through, like those which are very often ignored and unseen by adults. Before we go on to talking about, now being an especially difficult time for everyone, including children, but even in the general landscape, I want to begin by hearing your thoughts about why are we as adults, I don't know if I should call myself as an adult sometimes, because I also fall under the young adult category on which you guys write, but why are adults in general so afraid of imagining children as multidimensional individuals? It is very hard to separate children from innocence, and in doing so, you unsee and ignore a lot of the complexities that children go through. And even in my experience as a teacher, I think the first thing I realized was children are little adults. They're just like smaller in size, but they have the same world. They go through the same things. So very quickly, I just want to kick it off by understanding why you think we ignore them. We can start with Paro.
I've worked with a lot of children over the years, over 3 lakh children actually, which would be what in not lakh terms, but million terms, I don't know. But over 3 million, would that be sort of close to the mark? I never know. Anyway, so I've worked with a lot of children, a lot of them in difficult circumstances. Never once have I had a child say to me that one of my stories wasn't appropriate for them. It's always the gatekeepers. When I ask kids, what do you want me to write on next? And I always try and end in that. After the session, after everyone has dispersed, those 1 or 2 children who come and ask me to write stories, it's quite incredible what they ask me to write on. One girl in a village in Haryana, very conservative, small town, she came to me and actually wanted me to write a book on masturbation. Could I write that book? Maybe. Would it get published? Unlikely. Would it ever reach a school? Never. Because it's the gatekeepers who are constantly trying to keep it safe. And I think the reason is that they're scared of the questions that will follow.
Yeah. Nupur?
So actually, I want to refer to, Shranya, what you just said, which is, do I classify myself as an adult? And actually, I'd say it's that classification that gets us into trouble. It's that we forget that we are like little Russian dolls, actually, where our childlike selves are still very much inside us, though we have grown chronologically. And it's when we lose touch with that child inside, that adolescent inside, then we become that adult who is scared of those questions. And unfortunately, I find it's intergenerational. It's because we turn into these adults who were treated in a particular way as children. And so, you know, we're not terribly original. We just do a repetitive version of "Hamare yahan to aisa hi hota hai," and we just tumble along with that without an original experience allowed in our heads or our bodies, for that matter. So the short answer is because we forget that we were children once.
Yeah, that's lovely. David?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit oppositional, and I guess I should be since I'm the only male here. You know, I'm trying to focus a little bit on your question. And I think, in fact, that parents and adults do respect children tremendously. And they listen to children, except at the moment that a crisis ensues. When a crisis ensues, then all of a sudden, the child or the children are invisible because the adults feel that they have to solve a certain situation. And I think in trying to solve that situation, the child is completely forgotten. And so I wanted to go back to the idea that I think parents and adults are full of good intentions, though I also, you know, I agree with Paro about the idea, if we're going to be talking about what kinds of stories are told and published, that there are many, many gatekeepers.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, maybe Nupur can talk a little bit also about this idea of how, you know, when a child is born and he's born to a world where he or she is given so much love, but if there's a situation, and I don't know if COVID is one of those situations, forced migration, a flood or whatever, that all of a sudden changes things, all of a sudden the child is invisible.
Yeah, yeah. And we're gonna talk about this a lot because, I mean, speaking to what you all said, one of the reasons why in a situation of crisis we're unable to like understand or acknowledge what a child is going through is because many times the adults don't know how to deal with it, which is sort of a widespread issue of no one knowing how to access their emotions and not having the tools to deal with them. So because of that, and kids being the last in the rung, you know, kids can't often vocalize it. So it is hard to look after and care for someone when you're not able to do that for yourself. So, but what's really interesting about all three of you is that you're all using the medium of stories to, you know, give a platform or create an accessible way of looking into our emotions. And why I want to ask you about this is because there are multiple ways in which emotions can be addressed, right? There can be a class on it every morning. Let's be like mental health, like what Delhi is trying to do, a happiness class. You know, what is the difference between using stories, using fiction as a medium to access your emotions versus any other medium? So, and again, everyone's free to start. Now.
I think that stories are a safe space, first and foremost, to talk about really difficult things. And I'll give an example of me as a parent rather than me as a writer. A friend of mine had given a big box of her daughter's books that she had outgrown because my own kids were reading. My daughter was, I think, 9 or 10 years old. She picked out the biggest, fattest book in the box. I think she picked it out because her younger brother wouldn't be able to read it. It would irritate him. So she picked out that book. It was one I hadn't read. And she started to read it and she said, "Mama, you don't read this book." So I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because it'll be very embarrassing if you read it and you know that I've read it. It's embarrassing." So I thought, okay, love story. And she's just 9, 10 years old. And then halfway through, she said, "Acha, Mama, you read this story." I said, "Why?" And she said, because there are some questions I need to ask, but I can only ask them once you read it. Okay, I'm curious now. I was sitting with her when she finished reading it. She shut the book and she was kind of teary-eyed. And she said, Mama, you must read this book. I said, why? And she said, because it's a very important book. So immediately I started reading it, full of curiosity, thinking it was going to be a love story. And to my horror at that moment, it was actually a relationship between a young boy and an older man. And there were some pretty graphic scenes in that. And I was horrified, and I'm sort of looking askance at my daughter, thinking, what is she going to ask? How am I going to answer? And that dread was building up. And she was watching me read it. And I said, all right, what's your question? And I'm sweating bullets. And she said, they loved each other. Why was society so angry? I was so blown away by her question. You know, yeah. And when would I have thought it's all right for her to read a book, a relationship? Not when she's 9 and 10, maybe when she's 14, 15. But by then, you know, a whole lot of other things would have happened. She read it pre-prejudice.
Yeah.
It was very powerful.
Yeah, that's really powerful, yeah. Nupur, I think you were going to say something earlier also.
I was actually bubbling with a reaction to the happiness class because emotions, you know, we're so focused on keeping only the happy ones. And actually mental health is not about the happy emotions.
Yeah.
It's about all the other ones. The sadness, the grief, the rage, the jealousy, the envy that makes you want to destroy something that somebody else has because you can't bear it, that they have it. Mental health is about bearing those emotions. So anyway, that's between me and Delhi government. But, stories, we use them in our work with children and of all ages, or even the child parts of adults actually, because stories are what we call technically a displacement activity. It's not happening to you. It's happening to someone else, another character, but you can connect to that emotionally. So it's like Paro said, it's a safe space. The safety is you're not exposed.
Yeah.
So those parts of you that might be intrigued or curious, for example, theoretically speaking, about a same-sex relationship, are safely addressed because you can see it happening somewhere else and see the gentleness with which, or the violence with which, that it may have been treated. So, in fact, the first time I used a story was, I was a trainee psychologist and my client was 42 years old. I was 24. And he was about double my size, all directions. And and I remember being a little bit stuck in this work and knowing, what do I do? But I pulled out a story to read to him, which was about a little boy who ignored his feelings. And that was the breakthrough, because this huge man sat in front of me in the consulting room and wept and felt like that story had addressed his core conflict better than 10 sessions of psychological therapy. And it was, I'm very clear, that was the day I became really clear that stories are it. When you're stuck, take a story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to add that I think, you know, since we're all writers, I don't really write that many children's stories. I've only written 3. But what and most of my adult novels are political novels and also novels of love and curtailed love. But I feel that as when I write children's stories, I'm actually healing myself. I'm going through a process of exposing part of my personality and dealing with an issue that I felt was not dealt with when I was a child. And so that I find that the stories that I write are basically autobiographical. Although, you know, quite often I'm extrapolating from a core feeling and then creating another story. But I think also in the same way that readers can be somewhat healed and calmed by stories, I think when writers write and they confront an issue that has a lot of emotional charge, that it's a self-healing activity.
Yeah. So moving on to, you know, what the landscape of children's literature usually is, you know, we're trying to create fantasy, we're trying to show realities that don't necessarily exist, you know, which is in ways it's hopeful and all of those things, you know, but what often happens is as soon as you grow up and you leave home and go to college or wherever your first location is, and you're just shocked, you know, because you've been sheltered so much. If you are privileged to not have gone through something yourself, you know, it becomes really hard to even imagine someone else's experience because there are emotions that you haven't really thought of growing up or don't know how to process. For example, a lot of you, like with grief, with pain, you know, you don't know how to understand those feelings. So why is it that, I mean, what is the importance of children's literature actually broaching difficult and controversial subjects? Because like you said, there are gatekeepers. Even when you write these books, how often are they used in the classroom? You know, how do you make them accessible to children? And what has that journey been like in this space? And even like convincing someone to publish a book which deals with hard topics, because that's not the zone children's literature usually goes to. And all of you can speak about your specific things. Like David, you deal with social political backdrops, you know. So what has that been like?
Well, you know, again, what I want to just clarify, it's when I write children's stories, that they tend to have much more of an emotional core rather than a larger social background. Although the two of my stories, one is called La Casita, the little house, which is the name of a restaurant, and a chapter book that's being published in October by Groundwood that's called Sleeping with the Light On. The backdrop is a coup d'etat in Guatemala that affects a family and forces a family to migrate and to move. And in that case, the social and political enters into the situation because, again, the parents don't know how to deal with what's happening outside. Bombs are being dropped, leaflets are being dropped as well, bullets are zinging into the restaurant, and they are in panic mode, and they must act. And when adults need to act, the child, no one comes up to the child and says, listen, I'm going to explain to you what's happening. Probably because they think the child can't understand what bullets flying might imply. Mm-hmm. But of course, the child does know that and feels that and understands that. But the time isn't taken to explain to the child. The child is sort of like the last one to know what's going on. And I think that's, you know, that's why, going back to what Paro was talking about, you know, two stories, one of male love being read by a 9-year-old, and then a child coming up to her and asking her, why doesn't she write a book about masturbation? It's just sort of took my breath away, you know, yeah. Because this is sort of shooting straight.
Yeah. Paro, Nupur?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when I was asked to write a book on Gandhi because it was 150 years of Gandhi, and my first response was no, because what more can one say about Gandhi? And kids are bored with it and have no connection with it. And then I managed to write this book, Being Gandhi, which is that Gandhian principle brought to the doorstep of a completely angsty, self-absorbed teen whose big problems in life are the zits on his face. But then there is a line which I think defines the book, where these riots break out and there is the mob comes outside their door. They're living in a block of flats, and they're shouting, and the mother is trying to block the door so that they don't come in. And the father doesn't move, and he says, "It's not for us." And they've come for the neighbors, because the neighbors belong to the wrong side, to the other side. And suddenly in that moment, this completely disassociated child, whose big problem is shot into a world where he's forced to not only be empathetic, but also to be a citizen of action. It's a call to action.
Yeah.
That's what a story can do. And no amount of lecture and, patriotic songs or anything would do. The kind of responses I've had to this book are quite amazing, with children coming up and asking me, so this is what's happening in my neighborhood. What can I do? Now you tell me what. And I'm saying, find your inner Gandhi. Find your way of objection and standing up, and then think about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, actually, what stayed with me was your question about, children not having gone through something, or not having gone through a difficult emotion, and therefore once you leave home, you're kind of out in your little bubble wrap thing. I think I'm going to kind of talk a little bit closer to home. When I first saw the topic of the panel in terms of divisiveness, I thought really about the divisiveness that we have in every home.
Yeah.
And how most families are not bubble wrapped.
Yeah.
And we again imagine that the child is the last one to know. Like, they have no clue about what's going on. Whereas actually that's a sort of pretend dissociation, or an enforced one, where you're like in a forced zombie state of, I don't really know what's going on. Whereas it's in the air you breathe. You know what's going on, but you daren't let anyone know that you know. The divisiveness is even within ourselves, that this part is not allowed to talk to that part. Because if I close the split, I am going to be suffering so much turmoil, right? So I go out into the world, I smoke pot, I'm zoned out, I listen to my music, I have my headphones on, and that becomes the caricature of the me who's very self-absorbed.
Yeah.
But it's the treatment that my insides have received over the first 10, 12 years of my life. And it makes me think about this dialogue in Dear Zindagi, where, it's Shah Rukh Khan delivering the dialogue that Gauri Shinde has written, where he says, when we are little, I only have the English translation here with me, which is that when we are little, we are told, and we want to cry, we're told, dry your tears, laugh. When we are angry, adults tell us, give us a smile. You know why? So that the home remains peaceful.
Yeah.
And when we want to hate, we don't get permission to. When we want to show love, we find that the entire emotional system is unregulated and we cannot function.
Yeah.
Because tears, anger, and hate, and nothing was allowed full expression. So how shall we know how to express love?
Yeah.
So how shall we know how to express or how to feel anything for somebody else when we weren't allowed our own feelings?
Yeah.
The most disturbing thing that I found in working with young people in schools is that violence and death are easier to pass through the gatekeepers and love and sex. Love and sex is the big bad wolf. So I've had a book called No Guns at My Son's Funeral, repeatedly in many schools as recommended reading. But a book where there was a boy and girl who exchanged a briefcase in a school, that book was banned repeatedly in many schools.
Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about what you all have said about what Nupur you were saying about not having like the expression for something, you know, something that you've gone through, even if you've gone through it, not knowing what to call it, like not even having the vocabulary to name a child's emotions, and because you just don't think it's happened, you know. That's also been my experience as a teacher again, you know, to find out some of the things kids have gone through, and then not even knowing myself what to term it. And I find that in general, we're a society which can't access knowledge until it is given to us with a term, you know. So with mental health, you know, unless I tell you I'm having a panic attack or I'm going through a disorder of a kind, XYZ, I don't know what to call it. And with kids more so, you don't have these labels, you know. So because of where we were headed, I just want to actually bring up mental health crisis right now. And Nupur, you said this as well. Kids are largely absent from the conversation about the mental health crisis that we're all going through right now, you know, because of the pandemic. And so, what are the, actually, let's just begin with talking about what do you think about the role of the pandemic in highlighting these issues that kids are going through or young adults are going through, and that are not really part of any dialogue that we've had. Yeah.
I have my entire lockdown experience has been about children, because my entire team's working day, a week, month got shot to pieces because now we can't see people in person. And we found through that 2 or 3 things. One being that other than online schooling, we're not really hearing anything about children during the lockdown.
Yeah.
And like, that's pretty much like as far as our imagination goes. And then we have, that's it. Okay. It's like, you know, okay, throw them something to do. The other is that we need to understand also how children at different developmental stages and therefore ages are going to react to this differently. Younger children still find it easier to disappear into their heads, have an imaginary game, make something under the dining table and go into it for hours on end. Whereas a young adult, an adolescent, a teenager needs their peers. Like, it's like breathing. So for that age group, this is a desperate situation.
Yeah.
So the distress is at very different levels. Younger children might actually be quite happy, more or less, to have lots of time with their parents. Whereas your 12, 13 post-pubertal child will be like, okay, you know, I love you, but I kind of am sick of you now.
Yeah.
They also feel somewhat invincible.
Yes.
And therefore may be looking at the adults and saying, what's all the fuss about? I'm not going to get sick. I'm in really good physical shape. I miss my friends, and that's where I want to be. And if I get sick and I spend, you know, a week in bed, it's not the worst thing in life.
Yeah.
You know, so there is that kind of disconnect. You know, I though I'm from Guatemala, I've been living in the United States for too many years. And, you know, we don't have an adult as our president. So, you know, it's really an overwhelming situation when we don't, you know, basically speaking, we think of in the body politic that the president takes the role of the parent, you know, and provides leadership, can provide a certain degree of comfort, but is the captain of the ship, so to speak. And we are in a kind of rudderless boat in this country. So, you know, I think the parents are struggling to try to figure out whether they follow a despot who happens to be our president, or tries to follow the health practitioners that are trying to keep us alive. At least that's the situation here. I don't know what it's like in India, but I've read a little bit about your president, and I the word despot is not that far from my tongue.
Prime Minister. Yeah. I just wanted to come back to this word that you used, find a name for it, that a child may not know what to name something. Word desperate, he may not know that word. So I have a story in this book of mine called The Other. And there's a story called Learning to Love Again, which is about a child, a young girl who is raped by her uncle in her own home. And it's a sort of 350-degree story because it looks at one, the girl herself, her parents, her grandmother, her friend, a boy who really likes her, her teacher. So it looks at when a crime like rape happens, it happens to multiple people. Try, by the way, to try and also find the voice of the rapist, who I've put safely into prison. And the grandmother, who's the mother of the rapist, goes to prison with the girl's permission and says, I want to go and find out what gave him the permission to do this. So I couldn't, for one, I couldn't find the voice of the rapist. I didn't want to give him a platform in my story. But when I read this story to young people or even to adults, I've had so many people coming back. There was a young man in his 20s, I think, who said that he heard the story, he had read the book, and then he came down a street and he stopped dead in his tracks and realized that he had been raped as a child. And he didn't know what had happened to him. He never knew. There was an elderly man who came to me in Chandigarh and said, he was weeping. And he said that, I wish I had had this word. I wish I'd had this story, because his twin sister was being raped. And he didn't know what to do about it as a child himself. And the number of people who come and share their stories of sexual abuse, once they have this story, and how many have said, we need this story for young people so that they have a name and there's a platform to start talking.
That's very interesting. And it also makes me come back to what I was asking you all earlier, which is that even in your work as well, Nupur, where you're talking to children and you're using stories to do so, again, because children are not the authority and the parent is, how much censorship is involved when you're writing or speaking or dealing with children when it is with hard issues, given that, you know, the instinct for adults is to protect them from certain experiences or not talking about it because somehow that means it's not happening, right? So in your dealings with it, how do you navigate the gatekeepers again? Again, to going back to how do you get the books or the stories in the hands of those who actually need it?
After many rejections, I would say, yeah, it's the issue of the gatekeepers is a huge issue, and at least in this country, in the United States, you know, the editors and the publishers are the gatekeepers. They're the ones that feel that if a story cannot sell in Texas or California or North Dakota or South Dakota, as well as New York and Florida, then they don't want to buy it. And they're not interested in stories that have too much conflict, stories that are too long or too short. Everything has to fit a certain standard of 32 pages for a picture book, no more than 250 words. I mean, that's the part that I struggle with in terms of the gatekeepers. That you know, as writers, you know, we're used to having the work define the limits, and then you have to confront the editor and the acquiring editor who says, well, this really wouldn't work because it's too long, or you know, the topic of a young girl learning to kiss by kissing another young girl is not the message that we want to convey. Certainly not in Texas and Arizona and different parts of the country where it's more conservative.
And J.K. Rowling blew all of that out of the water, isn't it? She was rejected 7 times before Bloomsbury and it was a marketing person who decided, and that this was maybe something worth exploring.
But Paro, the exception doesn't always make the rule.
No, not at all.
And I would think you could agree.
Of course, certainly. But what I'm so grateful that at least she broke so many of those confines, at least for a while, at least for some. But I mean, there's no denying that children were not bothered by the heftiness of the book, the length of paragraphs, or the complexity of sentences. It didn't stop them reading the book.
Right.
Yeah, Nupur?
Well, what I'm hearing from you, Paro, is that you've come across readers. My struggle, I find, is that step itself.
Yeah.
That children are not reading.
Hmm.
They are not reading enough. They are not curious. They, a book is just too much work.
Hmm.
And their relationship with that quiet, that me in a book quiet, has not been developed sufficiently. And this links really quite a lot to what children are going through in the pandemic, lockdown, because we haven't, as a society, focused enough on activities that are just between me and me.
Yeah.
It's been very structured classes, school that's full of activities, lots of doing. There isn't enough of being.
Yeah.
And so when you say gatekeepers, yeah, sure, I deal with gatekeepers in the form of parents. And being a child psychotherapist is a very difficult thing, because there are times when, your hands are tied. Because this child's life is not going to change as long as this parent is parental. So, and we have to just know which battles to fight. But we often run into, I'll give you a story. Somebody called me in March when the lockdown in Delhi had just begun, and they said they had an 11-year-old who was really struggling and getting very anxious, and all the health worries that were in the air were kind of getting stuck to her literally in her imagination. And she was very distressed what to do. And my initial conversation was about, okay, what is this child's usual capacities about dealing with an internal state? Does she does she do imaginary play? No. Is she into physical activity? No. Does she read? No. Does she write stories? No. And I'm out of tools.
Yeah.
I'm far away. I can't see this child. This is poverty stricken as far as I'm concerned. This is a very impoverished internal state, because there's no little blocks lying around that can be put together to create a safety shell.
Yeah.
This is what troubles me as a mental health professional the most.
But I find that it's also a question of what are we giving children to read? What do they have access to? Because if it's the gatekeepers who are buying the books, then they're buying books that they are comfortable with, which may not be what the child wants to, unlikely that's what the child wants to read. And where and how much access to what they want, which is why I always go back to the question, what do you want to read? And I find that with a lot of my books, once they've heard a little bit, they want to read the rest of the story or the rest of the book or whatever, because it will engage them, because it's about them, it connects them. It's like looking at a mirror or stepping through a door into a world that belongs to them.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Nupur a question, if I could.
Yeah,
Are we
of
allowed
course.
to ask?
Of course.
Yeah. So I don't know how you feel about this Zoom format, but I am so exhausted by it because, here Nupur is talking about having kind of a therapy session, I would imagine, through Zoom. either with a parent or with a child. And all you really see, at least of Nupur, is her talking head, and maybe from her chest upwards. And so much of the gesture that we have, like when you're reading a story to 25 children, is you see the complete body and the complete scene. And it's, I find the format itself very difficult. I don't know how you would conduct a therapy session through Zoom. I really don't.
Well, I have to tell you that I don't. So the team has taken a huge beating. I put my cards on the table. I do believe, people will disagree with me in the field, psychotherapy with children online is not effective if you don't already know them.
Right.
So we have
Exactly.
found that
Of
there are
course.
young people and children who we have an existing relationship with have still conceded and come online and said, okay, fine, we'll continue. We struggle. It's horrible. It's exhausting. In a usual day, a usual busy day, we'd see 6 people in a day. That's tiring, yes. And 4 sessions in a day was light. 4 sessions a day was a good day. Now 4 sessions a day is a bad day. Because it is exhausting. You're absolutely right, David. I completely agree with you. And it's no fun.
Right.
I mean, I do also do this work because I love it. And this is just no fun.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing small children online, actually.
No, Zoom fatigue is real. Yeah, Paro, go on.
But I did do a writing workshop the other day on Zoom, 3 days, and I was surprised at how effective it was and the kind of honesty with which, and what was a very unique thing, which I think could only happen on Zoom, the participants were from 14 years to 75.
Wow.
Yeah.
Would never happen.
No.
Real time, I would ask the adults to go. But because there was an anonymity to it, I found that there was greater openness, even with somebody who was obviously much shyer, because they were in their own comfort zone of their room. They were able to express more. I was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
Zoom fatigue is real.
Zoom fatigue is real, but also we're all making the most of it, like we are right now. But
Of course, crazy.
yeah, I mean, I at least don't think that you can replace human contact and in-person meetings, because everyone's talking about the future and how it's going to change, and I really hope that is not something we change, because the essence of interaction cannot be replicated via a screen. So I have a lot of audience questions coming in, but before I take them, I have one last question, because we've spoken about all of the emotions that are uncomfortable to deal with and how you put them on paper or talk to children. But I want to understand, how important is hope then when we're talking about dark stories, when we're talking about painful things to talk about, rage, jealousy, all of the things that we mentioned, war. Is hope important? Is it important to be honest, but also be uplifting? How do you achieve that balance in the work that you do? Because that is a challenge, I would assume. Yeah.
Well, I was always a very optimistic child until my parents decided to leave Guatemala and come to the United States. So I feel like I always lived in a kind of Edenic world, in that bubble that we've described for the last 45 minutes. And I've noticed, or actually my wife noticed in the 5 novels that I've written, that that a lot of the characters in my books are unlikable characters that from the start you dislike. One man who's a businessman, who's a womanizer, who is clearly very, very angry at his mother and at women in general. But they all go through transformation, and in all my books, they all end up not 100% clearly with hope, but there's there's an idea that there is going to be something positive coming out of everything that's been suffered. And I think without that, I think literature suffers, because we're already beaten down as it is in society, and to go to literature, to go to art, and to be beaten down as well is not what we want. So yes, I'm an eternal optimist.
In my writing, I try and not have any taboos upon myself as a writer. The only taboo, I would say, or the only restriction I put upon myself when writing for young people, especially young adults, is that it should end on a note of hope and not in a place of hopelessness. In the rape story, the title is called Learning to Love Again. So that, because it was such a harsh story, that from the very title, I wanted that there is life at the end of this. So that is the one and only taboo that I put upon myself. The teenage years are a very dark time. And I think that we have to show that no matter how dark that tunnel is, there is some light at the end of it.
Nupur?
Well, I, of course, would be out of work if I didn't live on that. It isn't easy because, and yeah, I think hopelessness, cynicism is worse than hopelessness. And personally, for me, the struggle is against the cynicism. And it's quite cool at a certain age, no? When you're sort of like in your early 20s to be cynical, and would kind of like overcome that one. So it is painful to yeah, I'm struggling here because David, I'm remembering your statement where you said that, you know, you were an optimistic child, and I think I was a bit of a dissociated child. So hope and light at the end of the tunnel is something I've come to much later. And I can identify with the young person and the child sort of blankness and bleakness sometimes. The hope in that is really just to persist, just be there and persist. So as I'm thinking right now about 11-year-old who's been now in therapy with us for 2 years. And now at the end of almost 2 years of work, trusts us enough to start telling us her story.
Wow.
Right. And there's no shortcut to that. We have to earn our stripes by being there, by believing that the relationship is valuable, that you are valuable. And so it's more about, I think in our case, me and my team, like the living the hope by returning every week, attending to you, attending to ourselves. And J.K. Rowling has been, you know, my sort of quasi-therapist for many years, because I go back to Harry Potter every time I'm going through a hard time. I think it's a bit subconscious because over the lockdown, I started reading them backwards. I don't know what that was about.
Yeah.
I've also found
I think
much of those stories that we write as adults for young people. But one is also what young people themselves write in whatever platform, because I work with a lot of people who've never had a platform to say what they want to say, to tell their stories. So I found like, you know, children traumatized by conflict and terrorism with grown-up violence, to give them that platform was something extraordinary what came out of that.
Yeah. You know, so I'm going to actually start taking questions now, and because it's relevant to what you were talking about what children are, you know, exposed to right now, given the lockdown. And B, so Ria asks that in the light of the conversation around mental health and COVID, we've discussed how children are sort of struggling with a lot of emotions during this period, but what are your feelings about the pressures of online learning, as well as the exposure to social media and its role in the lives of children? Because like you were saying, Nupur, this child who was struggling to sort of grasp all the medical information that's been thrown at us, and I know that all of us have struggled with it. I have, you know, and because children are also now have way more access to social media and all of this information, I assume that, I mean, not I assume, I'm sure the effects of that are real and far more, perhaps. So she asks that, what are your feelings about these things?
See, online learning, honestly, sucks. Because I don't know who went to school to learn. I didn't. As in like learn from a book, learn. Though it turns out I have a lot of information in my head, but I don't remember being terribly focused on it. I don't know how it got in there. What children go to school for is the social part of it. So online learning is all the worst parts of school without any of the fun parts of school. You know, there's no banging, crashing into each other in the corridors, going to other classrooms, teasing each other, playing football, all the politics about who likes whom, and etc. And all the music class, the craft lesson, the PE, the sweat and the canteen and the ice cream. So online school really is very dull. Though, I mean, they are trying their best. And I think that we're getting better at it as a community of adults who have to deal with this crisis.
I mean, it's, you know, again, going back, it's really talking heads, and all of us are more than just talking heads. There's and in terms of social media, again, it's also a kind of disconnected work, because you know, people put things out and then people react. I'm not altogether clear why people are posting. Sometimes I question myself why I'm posting. You know, just am I putting something up on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook simply because I'm feeling lonely and disconnected, or do I have a good take on something? Have I read an article? Or when I comment on somebody's post, you know, someone who says, you know, for the last 2 months I've been in lockdown and I've had fevers and sweats and I'm just beginning to eat. You know, you feel like I would want to embrace that person, but I can't. You know, all I can do is write something.
So there's Shujot asks, he asked that, I assume, how do we navigate children? How do we navigate children through ideas of otherness and towards acceptance of diverse identities before they come face to face with their negative connotations? And I'd actually like to point this. I mean, everyone's free to answer, but I was reading Yellow Flowers of August yesterday, Paro, as I said, and one of the things I found very interesting was the way you deal with the Hindu-Muslim identity and the conflict between that, and often the prejudices, as we've acknowledged, kids know, you know, it percolates down to them. So I thought you did it really masterfully, you know, the way you got the prejudice, you know, for a child to think about it in the way you did it in your story. So I think, how do you go about this, and how do you make the child question something so well?
Thank you for loving the story. I'm going to answer this question with an example. It's basically about this young Kashmiri Muslim, a Kashmiri Pandit girl who's brought up to hate Muslims because she's told her father has been killed by a Muslim bomb. And she goes to school, she falls in love with a Muslim boy. So, and he talks to her and says, his line is, all Muslims are not terrorists and bombs don't have a religion. After narrating this story in a particular school where I was a visitor, this one boy stood up and said, I'll agree with you that all Muslims are not terrorists, but you'll have to agree that almost all terrorists are Muslims. And what do you have to say about that? Now, where would a 12-year-old get that argument except around his dinner table? It came from adults, right? He's along with his dinner, he's being fed hate.
Yeah.
So I was lucky that a sort of response and answer came to me. So I said, all right, let's put aside the question of religion for a moment. Let's think of a crime like rape. And of course, we should all agree that all men are not rapists, but you'll have to agree with me that almost all rapists are men. So in which case, I said, son, you're a boy, so I'll treat you like a potential rapist. I will hate you simply because you're a boy and therefore a potential rapist. I don't know your name, but I hate you. I'll never be friends with you. And is that acceptable to you? And he was kind of taken aback. And by this time we were nose to nose. And from the corner of my eye, I saw his fist ball up because, you know, I was confronting him like that. And then suddenly the whole auditorium was up on its feet and clapping. And he said, I finally got it.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful.
Yeah. David, do you want to weigh in?
No, I've just been floored. It's a beautiful story.
Nupur, do you have anything? Yeah, should I? Okay, so Manjari asks, what do you all think about the figure of the imaginary friend or the toy that children often speak to? And what is that trope or not about? What might it say about the emotional lives of children? Again.
There's no one answer to that. I'd have to ask the child, honestly, because it's in that child's imaginary life. But the toy that is important exists in not just the cultural imagination, but and therefore is permitted in lots of communities. Children are clutching something that keeps them safe, gives them a sense of safety that they carry around with them. Yeah. And in French-speaking countries, they have a word for it as well, where the child takes that little toy to nursery with them for the first time when they're going, because it's a security blanket. So, I mean, in psychoanalytic literature, we call it a transitional object. And it is meant for that transition from the safety of the home, the mother, and everything that stands for. As you go out into the internal world, you symbolize it and you take it with you in the form of this thing. And then, so what that imaginary person, friend turns into, who you can then be separate from, but joined to because it only exists in your head. It's a very important emotional relationship between parts of us, or that child. It makes me think about Dumbledore saying to Harry, just because it's in your head doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah. Paro, did you want to say something? I thought you did.
Well, I have always had an imaginary friend. And in fact, I was, I think 12 years old, and wanting to get chosen in gymnastics for a gymnastics display in school. But I couldn't do a headstand, and you couldn't be chosen unless you could do it. So I came home and trying to practice as Paro, I couldn't. So my imaginary friend said, I'll tell you how to do it. She stood on her head. And while I'm standing on my head, I'm thinking, this is Paro's timing. So it's been most useful to me.
I would do that for exercise. I would have to wake up and exercise. And in my head, I had really gone for a run. And I truly believe that. And I used to wake up being like, so did I wake up or did I not? But it was really good to know that someone of me ran. So
No,
So,
I just wanted to add that I think that a transitional object is very different than an imaginary friend, because you can abuse a transitional object. You can try and rip it apart. You can try and throw it. It's something that is part of you. It's in you. I imagine that the imaginary friend, and I never had one, is almost always a kind of an idealized person, a safe place, something or someone who is not judging you, and cannot be the object of your anger. And I think I was very tough on my stuffed animals.
And David, that actually brings me to the topic of your, the title of your book, Sleeping with the Light On. And so does this connect to that? Because that lamp seems to have a significance for that boy. And am I right in saying that?
Yeah, again, it's a story. Sleeping with the Light On takes place in Guatemala in 1954, when there was a coup, and the parents own a restaurant. And what the child most desires during that period is the blackouts and the curfews, because then the whole family is able to sleep underneath the dining room table, and all the tensions that the father and the mother feel kind of dissipate as the child is able to touch them. And so on those nights when there is electricity, the child needs the light on as a form of parental protection. And I think it's important that the nightlight has a covering that shows waves breaking on a beach as it turns, and it's just really a form of comfort.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to read that book.
You may in October. Thank you, Paro.
So there are actually a few parents who ask, what is your advice to parents who are aware and who want to do it differently? Where do they begin? And where should we look for the right kind of content and acknowledge what a child is going through when we're sometimes unable to acknowledge it for ourselves? And I think that's an important one. Nupur, do you want to?
No, actually, I was looking at Paro.
Anyone?
I think what I found most useful, both as a parent and a writer and a teacher, read what your children are reading, talk about it, have an open shelf policy. Let them pick out whatever book they want. If they find that it's too difficult, too daunting, they'll put it down themselves. Obviously, you're not going to have pornography on there, but other than that, I read Bertolt Brecht and the Great American Plays when I was 11 and 12 years old. It didn't do any harm at all. I was reading Noddy and that at the same time. There shouldn't be that. But we read the same books, talk about it, keep the doors open.
Yeah. Nupur, you were speaking about reading, the lost habit of reading earlier, that kids are not reading, let alone choosing a book for them if they're not reading. So do you want to speak to that?
The parent was asking where to begin. Maybe, a lot of homes don't have books, like
That's
physical books.
Sad story.
Yeah, and because parents don't read. There are magazines maybe or newspapers, and that's about it. And so these things are also intergenerational. So it's how do you inculcate in a child a love for reading, or just even that as a possibility, as an imagination, when you've got 6 devices that will just do something for you instead. So a lot of it actually begins by the reading to them when they are too little to read. And I realize that some of our listeners may may not find this relevant. But finding stories that mattered to you, you'll have to scrounge around somewhere inside of you to find that. And really, like Paro said, leave them lying around. It's that lying around thing, it works the same with what's coming on the dining table to eat, and they're like, okay, I'm not going to eat this vegetable because it looks suspicious, and everybody seems to be very interested in making sure it goes down my throat. It's similar with books. If you give them a list of these are self-improving books, you must read them, ranging from Treasure Island to Black Beauty to Gandhi's childhood, there's going to be rebellion. But if you leave it lying around, you're much more likely to have them pick it up.
Yeah. To that, I want to ask you.
As a child, we read as a family. All of us sat together and we had about an hour where some classical music would be put on and we would read. I hated that time. It a waste of my day, of that 1 hour. I'd rather be talking, rather be doing, until I found that one book with just me.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I mean, not only a reader, I became a writer.
Yeah. To that, actually, Nupur, I want to ask you, as someone who does counseling for kids, therapy for kids is often considered a failure of the parent, or parents are not able to identify when a child needs therapy. And so, do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, of course, a parent does. We all do take it personally that the child needs therapy, needs some help.
Yeah.
Sometimes as parents, we aren't the best people for a particular, to do something particular, because we are kind of implicated in it. And the safe stranger person is much safer. And in fact, there's a chapter in my book, Love and Rage, which is called When to Talk to a Stranger, which of course is because we're always taught not to talk to strangers. And when a stranger is not a bad idea at all. The thing is that counseling or psychotherapy for children is like the last resort, I find, right? When everything else has, including the Ayurveda and the homeopathy, has been tried and it has not worked, then you reach the psychotherapist, which means that we aren't exactly dealing with small issues. Sometimes we're dealing with things that have been embedded and stuck for years. They have been in development for years. And we are not magicians.
I thought you were.
We don't do magic. It's slow, it's hard work. And if it's been 6 years in the making, it might actually even be 6 years in the undoing.
Yeah.
So these are some of the honest things that we have to say to our clients. They don't like us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as parents not liking that their children need to see somebody else, that actually we're an important but small part of our children's lives. And then it kind of grows like that. And shortly, there will be influences on your child in any case that you have no clue about.
Yeah.
Including from books. Yeah. So we have to sort of swallow our own sense of narcissistic self-importance and be like, yeah, well, I have my limits.
Yeah. There's something I want to ask, which is also asked here, is that specifically Paro and David, both of you are, you're older than the audience you write for. And so how do you, of course, in some senses, feelings are the same. Everyone goes through the same feelings, whether a child or an adult, in different forms. But is it true to say that, you say that this generation is going through a lot more and we didn't go through such things, or mental health didn't exist for us? These kind of things are often told because mental health is now like the trendy conversation. So how do you stay abreast with maybe what kids today are going through, like young kids are going through, for example, with the boys' locker room conversation that happened on Twitter, which David was a problem that happened in India, in Delhi, where an Instagram account was discovered where young boys were talking and objectifying women's bodies. And so how do you stay up to date with what kids today are going through and what they're engaging with when you're not in that age group and I assume not in the circle? Yeah, and David, I want to hear from both of you, but I also want to know that your book is based in 1950s, right. And it comes out in October 2020. And what are the connections and bridges between feelings today? So yeah, long question, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's a long question, but writers write, and it's really editors that decide whether or not a particular book set in 1950s is relevant in 2020. In terms of my book, the issue of migration is important. Yeah. And then the issue, which is similar to COVID, which is not that far from a coup d'etat, is that something is happening which the children don't understand. Yeah. And when that crisis is imploding and exploding, the child of the 50s is like the child of 2020. The emotions are the same, the feelings are the same, the reactions are the same. So I don't think it's that much of a leap. And going back to something that Nupur said, is talking about the Russian dolls. I think we all, as writers, if we are good writers, we carry our childhood on our sleeve. It's something that we just never dispense with.
Thank you.
For me, it is that I work a lot with young people, and I'm always eavesdropping on conversations. So a lot of my writing is informed by them, both by theme and by the language used. One of the biggest compliments I've ever got was I published a story in a paper, and a teenager wrote in and said, "Thank goodness you finally got a teenager to write for teenagers." That's a good
success.
compliment. I'll take it. But it's also true, a bit on a more serious note, how frighteningly history keeps repeating itself. Being Gandhi is set in the 1980s, deadly relevant today. I spent about 2.5 years writing a book called Nomad's Land, which is on rootlessness, forced migration, and fleeing your country. I started writing it 2.5 years ago. I've just completed it. It's about to go into print. October, it'll come out. It's more relevant today than when I started writing it, because there is a cyclical nature and we need to remind our children about it. When I talked of 1984 and the anti-Sikh riots after Indira Gandhi's assassination, kids in class said, "Oh, that was ancient history." And for me, I had lived it. So it wasn't ancient history. And I knew that, okay, these are things. If we forget them, we'll repeat them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I want to say that it's far more important to have somebody around who holds the history in our minds than to be up to date with the latest slang and the latest what goings on, though that does give one some sort of street cred. So, and they're more likely to listen to you and not sort of relegate you to the ancient history bookshelf.
Yeah.
Someone has to keep the thread.
David, how do you stay up to date with it? I mean, I truly think that your book is extremely relevant today, and which is what I found so, like you said, it's frightening how relevant it is even today, and how children are going through the same thing in different parts of the world, and we're all fighting a war against COVID right now, right? So for the first time, the stakes are equal. Everyone in some form is going through that situation. So yeah, how do you, I think I didn't let you tell me that, so you want to weigh in?
Okay, first of all, I want to take this opportunity to thank you and the Belong Festival for the opportunity to talk about these subjects. That's really something that hasn't been said, but it's really great. Well, I have 3 daughters and now I have 4 grandchildren. So, you know, I'm, you know, very connected. It's not as if I live in a world of isolation. I have, you know, dozens of cousins and 12 uncles, most of them dead now, unfortunately. But it's just being part of a community, I think, is very important as a way of being connected to at least my past, my experiences, and what I think children are going through today, which is, as Nupur said, I think is not that different.
Yeah.
Or as Paro said in terms of, you know, her book on Gandhi, which is set in the 80s, that certainly touches a period 50 years earlier or 60 years earlier.
So we have about 5 minutes, and actually, I just wanna close out. But before that, I just want to hear any last things you have to say about this particular topic. And yeah, over to you.
Again, I just want to say this opportunity to
Yes.
speak to you 3 marvelous people has been great for us, and I hope that the public has benefited from this very honest and revealing this panel.
Thank you.
I think all I wanted to say is, of course, thank you, but trust young people much more than we do. They're much wiser than we give them credit for. And be brave, talk dirty to your kids, it's fine.
The tagline of the session.
Talk dirty.
Talk dirty to your kids. Nupur?
Yes, thank you very much for putting this together and inviting us to it. I really have been, from when the title came on in the email about, you know, children in divisiveness, I just keep coming back to the divisiveness that we keep seeing in our consulting rooms all the time, which is internal parts, this part not talking to the other. And and I find that there is this, what made me say that, you know, it's really important to have someone who keeps the history. And like you said, David, the link to your past. It's actually much easier to stay in the now and the forward and forget about the past. And that causes problems. That causes huge problems. So a lot of the divisiveness is not just sort of sideways, but also in depth, like back to front. We need to keep those connections going for our children, our family histories, cultural histories, social change, and how that has come to be. And you know, so lots of talking at dining tables, through books, or just through family stories.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to, before I say thank you, I just want to say that the work you do is so important, because when I was going through all your work, what stood out to me is that often, apart from ignoring what children go through, we also ignore children's literature, you know, because so often even at a lit fest, children's literature is a book reading. It's not a conversation about why it's relevant. And then we grow up and then we wonder why adults don't know how to deal with their feelings, because we've ignored them for so long. And so it's, the work you do is so important. And I hope that, you know, people do read them and, you know, participate and invest in children's growth and their access to emotions, where we have adults who know how to acknowledge their emotions and are proud of being able to do so. Because I think that a lot of my peers, you know, find that very difficult, and we're all still learning how to do that because so much has been left unaddressed. So thank you so much. And this was such a great panel to moderate. And I'm so grateful that I got the chance to talk to people like you. I don't know if I would ever get the chance otherwise. So thank you so much.
Well done, Shranya.
Thank you for your energy and your passion.
Thank you. Yes, that's really kind.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you, Shranya,